Welcome back, honeys. It's Tuesday, and you know what that means. Brand new Beesness. We wanted to take a minute right off the bat to acknowledge and apologize for our recent Spotify distribution problems, but also thank you for your ongoing support via other platforms like Apple Music, YouTube, etc. I promise we are working hard at fixing that, honeys, and as soon as it can go back to normal, you will see all of our updates, our episodes from the last 2 months in your Spotify feeds. Without any further ado, let's get buzzing. As always, we'll start with our follow-ups. The National Gallery Alexandros Soutsos Museum of Athens decided to permanently remove 4 artworks by Greek artist Christoforos Katsidiotis from a group exhibition less than a week after a far-right politician, one Nikolaos Papadopoulos, pulled them off the wall and damaged them. More clarity was given by the institution's director in a follow-up press conference at the museum. He stated that Katsidiotis' works were not from the permanent collections of the museum, also that school visits did not include this particular exhibition. Finally, he went on to say that Papadopoulos and his accomplice visited the exhibition twice and waited for the crowds to thin before they took their actions. The museum at large said the decision to remove the art was done with permission from Katsidiotis for, quote, the safety of the museum, the artworks, the employees, and the visitors, as well as the restoration of the smooth functioning of the institution, end quote. Papadopoulos' penalization, a one-time 50% pay reduction, is reportedly the harshest disciplinary measure that can be administered to a politician, but he will not be removed from his post. We had previously covered the arrest of members of a crime ring who were involved with Warhol and Pollock thefts. Now they have received prison time. Thomas Trotta was the 4th person sentenced as part of a multi-state investigation into over 20 years of thefts at 20 museums, institutions, and stores across 6 states and in Washington, D.C. Trotta was given an 8-year prison sentence on March 13th, which also included a requirement to repay $2.8 million in restitution. Trotta's lawyer, Joe DeAndrea, told the Associated Press that his client was, quote, the main burglar. He was the one who went into the institutions and burglarized them, end quote. So the sentencing is not terribly surprising. The stolen items included Warhol's silkscreen Le Grand Passion of 1984 and Pollock's painting Spring's Winter from 1949, also from the Everhart Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 2005. Its current estimated value is $12 million US. Trotta admitted to the theft of both of those in particular. It seemed to be a big week overall for sentencing, as 3 men were also convicted for stealing Maurizio Catalan's golden toilet artwork. A jury at Oxford Crown Court came to the following verdicts. Note that the sentencing is yet to come, however. We had Michael Jones found guilty of burglary, Fred Doe found guilty of conspiracy to convert or transfer criminal property, while Bora Gukic was found not guilty for the same. It appears we are still waiting for the verdict on James Sheen, a builder who employed Jones and previously pled guilty to burglary. Said Shan Saunders from the Crown Prosecution Service, quote, it has been a complex case to prosecute involving a nationwide investigation with many lines of inquiry to identify those who were subsequently charged in relation to the theft. While none of the gold was ever recovered, no doubt having been broken up or melted down and sold on soon after it was stolen, we are confident this prosecution has played a part in disrupting a wider crime and money laundering network, end quote. We had one major story in our sales, auctions, and events category. An M.F. Husain painting has made auction history by becoming the most expensive work of modern Indian art ever publicly auctioned after it sold on March 19th for $13.8 million US at Christie's, New York. The work in question is a 1954 painting called Untitled, or Gram Yatra. It blew its estimate of $2.5 to $3.5 million completely out of the water and beat the artist's previous record of $3.1 million by over 4 times. The painting is made up of 13 different vignettes of Indian village life, and it was made, according to Nishad Avari, the New York-based head of Christie's South Asian Modern and Contemporary Art Department, 5 years after Indian independence, as, quote, Husain and all his colleagues were trying to figure out at the time what it means to be a modern Indian artist, end quote. The headline caught our attention, honeys, because it shows how even though the larger market is in turmoil, South Asian modern and contemporary art continues to gather momentum and perform especially well. Our next headline, antiquities looted by a notorious smuggling ring have been returned to Nepal. The Manhattan District Attorney's Antiquities Trafficking Unit announced the return of 20 looted antiquities collectively worth over $3 million US to Nepal this month. Among them were works recovered through several investigations into an antiquities smuggling operation linked to disgraced art dealer Subhash Kapoor. Kapoor built his fortune by trafficking over 2,600 individual objects through his Madison Avenue gallery, Art of the Past. He became known as, quote, one of the most prolific smugglers in the world, end quote, after he and 5 of his conspirators were sentenced to 10 years in prison in India back in 2022 for stealing and illegally exporting 19 antique idols from a temple in the state of Tamil Nadu. His extradition to the U.S. is still pending. Some of the works returned include a 15th century religious painting depicting military governor Gagashim Baro with 2 of his wives, a 9th century Buddha figure, and a statue of a Hindu deity. These, plus 2 other portraits, were flagged by the anonymous repatriation advocacy initiative Lost Arts of Nepal, or LAN, in 2023 after they matched the deity to a 1975 photograph taken at the Vishnu Devi Temple complex in Kathmandu. The deity statue was subsequently seized from the holdings of late New York collector Robert Hatfield Ellsworth. As you may guess, honeys, we noticed this one because of the repatriation element, but also kind of fascinating because it's true crime. And honeys, I really meant it when I said last week was the one for sentencing because former New York City art advisor Lisa Schiff received her sentence of 2.5 years to prison. So who is Schiff? Art News describes her as, quote, once a sought-after art advisor with a clientele that included Hollywood A-listers like Leonardo DiCaprio, end quote, who operated Schiff Fine Art, an advisory firm specializing in high-end contemporary artists. She was sentenced to 30 months in prison on March 19th for defrauding multiple clients out of approximately $6.5 million worth of business transactions in a years-long scheme that affected at least 12 clients and involved 55 artworks by the likes of Sarah Lucas and Wengechi Mutu. The first suit against her appeared in May of 2023 when 3 clients/friends of hers, real estate heiress and collector Candace Carmel Barash, Richard Grossman, and his spouse Adam Sheffer, accused her of not fully compensating them for the $2.5 million sale of a jointly owned Adrian Genny painting. This led to other lawsuits by these same parties and others, plus a Schiff bankruptcy filing in January of 2024. She went on in October of 2024 to plead guilty to 1 count of wire fraud. Along with her prison sentence, she was ordered to pay a forfeiture of over $6.4 million and over $9 million in restitution. We care about this one for 2 main reasons, honeys. And the first is how ironic and sad of a twist this headline is. Schiff herself told the Financial Times back in 2017, quote, my main job is to make the art world transparent, to help empower collectors. It's such a complex world and very opaque, end quote. Art News also writes that her fall from grace sent shockwaves through the art world and raised questions about oversight and the lack thereof in such high-value private transactions. A question surrounding a number of our recent Beesness stories. Quote, while she has pled guilty and expressed remorse, many of her former clients remain unconvinced, viewing her admissions, particularly an interview with the New York Times, as an attempt to secure a lighter sentence, end quote. In the interview they're referring to there, which occurred last month, she claimed that the flashy lifestyle funded in part by this fraud, quote, wasn't even fun, end quote, and that Schiff worried for her health because of the guilt by the end. All in all, another embarrassing scandal for the arts market. Eyebrows were also raised by the departure of art critic Jackson Arn of the New Yorker magazine after, quote, inappropriate behavior, end quote. Arn had written criticism for such major outlets as Art in America and Art Forum before joining the team of the New Yorker in 2003. He covered a range of art world topics from tattoo conventions to bring QC sculptures. The New York Times reports that the critic has been let go following complaints of quote, inappropriate overtures, end quote, at the magazine's 100th anniversary party last month. Two attendees confirmed to the Times, quote, that Arn appeared intoxicated and that he was indecorous with some of the guests, end quote. On a slightly more absurd note, a new call to return the Statue of Liberty to France has drawn international attention. According to reports by Le Parisien and AFP, a fight has been brewing between the White House and center-left politician Raphael Glucksmann for a little over 2 weeks. The latter said in a speech on the Sunday before last in Paris that the U.S. should, quote, give us back the Statue of Liberty. It was our gift to you, but apparently you despise her, so she'll be happy here with us, end quote, to cheers from the gathered crowd. He was apparently specifically addressing Trump supporters and his government, quote, who have chosen to side with tyrants, end quote, and, quote, the Americans who fired researchers for demanding scientific freedom, end quote. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded at a press conference that the U.S. would absolutely not give back the monument, quote, and my advice to that unnamed low-level French politician would be to remind them that it's only because of the United States of America that the French are not speaking German right now, end quote. Glucksmann subsequently shot back on social media that nobody was coming for the statue and his comment had been symbolic. Updates on the beef will be provided when we hear more. On a bit sadder of a note, we heard last week that Fred Eversley, a former NASA engineer turned sculptor who fused art and science, has passed at age 83. He died unexpectedly on March 14th following a brief illness, according to the spokesperson for the David Kordansky Gallery, which has represented the artist since 2018. Writes Hyperallergic, quote, although he is associated with the light and space movement, the title under which these artists came to be known, what set Eversley apart from his colleagues was his overriding interest in the scientific basis behind his artwork, rather than any sort of spiritual or transcendent underpinnings, end quote. I just recently got to see some of his work for the first time in person when I visited the Nelson Atkins, and I can confirm he will be missed. Marina Abramovic, who is famous for her staring across the table artwork, has announced a new NFT project in the last week as well. It will be called Marina Abramovic Element and will be done through a partnership with TAEX. It will comprise of 3 NFT drops with games and collectible items supposedly aimed at creating an immersive experience into the artist's practice. The drops will begin on April 8th, followed by an NFT release in May. We additionally heard that the Miami Beach mayor has pulled his motion to defund a cinema screening No Other Land. Miami Beach Mayor Stephen Miner withdrew his controversial proposal to defund and evict an independent nonprofit movie theater titled O Cinema that refused to cancel screenings of the Oscar-winning documentary after he received major blowback at a heated public comment session in a city commission meeting on March 19th. The Florida mayor has drawn international criticism in the last couple of weeks for repeatedly attempting to intimidate O Cinema into calling off its programming of the film, which he claimed in a March 5th letter to the theater's CEO is, quote, a one-sided propaganda attack on the Jewish people, end quote. Miner submitted a resolution to terminate the cinema's lease on city-owned property and to pull $80,000 of public grant funding within the same week. O Cinema at first complied with the mayor's demands, but then reversed course by proceeding with last week's scheduled sold-out screenings and adding even more showings. The comment session at City Council was attended by dozens of residents, including culture sector workers, who insisted on the cinema's First Amendment right to show the 90-minute film co-directed by 2 Israeli and 2 Palestinian filmmakers. Previous Brooklyn Museum director Arnold Lehman spoke in support and with hopeful tones as well, citing an unsuccessful attempt by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani to evict the Brooklyn Museum from its city-owned property from hosting a provocative exhibition back in 1999 as a potential precedent. Mayor Miner also deferred another resolution of his introduced at the beginning of the meeting and which was similarly unpopular that would have required O Cinema to show, quote, the current Israeli perspective, end quote, alongside No Other Land. The why we care here is very obvious, honey. On March 18th, the National Coalition Against Censorship condemned these attacks on the theater in a public statement, quote, when the government uses its power to suppress ideas it disagrees with, we all have a duty to object, even when, and perhaps especially when, we do not agree with those ideas, end quote. Last week was also a crazy one in administration news as Trump first moved to axe 7 federal agencies, including key library and media funds, then ended up naming a new director of one of these agencies instead. On Friday, March 14th, Trump signed an executive order titled, quote, continuing the reduction of the federal bureaucracy, end quote, which would have dismantled 7 federal agencies, including the one overseeing Voice of America, or VOA, as well as the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS. The order demanded the agency heads eliminate all non-mandatory functions and scale back required ones to the legal minimum, according to our sources, yet leaders of the targeted agencies had only been given 7 days to submit their plans for compliance. And here, honeys, we'll circle back to do a bit of a who's who. The VOA is an international source of independent journalism for global audiences, particularly those in authoritarian states. The ILMS is a critical source of funding for libraries, museums, and archives across the country. It awarded $266.7 million in grants across the U.S. and Puerto Rico in fiscal year 2024. These funds help keep especially rural and underserved communities as cultural institutions afloat and are a lifeline for most libraries. Heather Arnett, executive director and CEO of the Heckscher Museum in New York, told Hyperallergic that smaller community-oriented museums will likely suffer the most from IMLS cuts as they, quote, do not have billion-dollar endowments and look to federal agencies to provide necessary resources, end quote. Other agencies facing the chopping block included Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, which works to prevent labor disputes, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is a nonpartisan think tank focused on public policy research, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, and the Minority Business Development Agency. As you may have heard, uproar then ensued with the American Library Association, among others, calling this a White House assault on the IMLS, asking Trump to reconsider this, quote, short-sighted decision, end quote, and them calling on U.S. Congress members and senators to advocate for libraries' modest federal funding by checking out books en masse. Instead of being cut entirely, the IMLS was then appointed a new head, Keith E. Sonderling, who was sworn in as acting director on Thursday, but was also confirmed as deputy secretary of the Department of Labor last week. He will apparently pull double duty. The biggest concern of this headline, honeys, is that the legal path forward remains so unclear. We don't know how or in what form ILMS or VOA will proceed from here. As Sonderling said recently, quote, I am committed to steering this organization in lockstep with this administration to enhance efficiency and bolster innovation. We will revitalize IMLS and restore focus on patriotism, ensuring we preserve our country's core values, promote American exceptionalism, and cultivate love of country and future generations, end quote. However, a federal judge in California has already ruled against some of the administration's recent agency cuts as overreaches, writing in a memo granting an injunction against the Office of Personnel Management that despite the heads of federal agencies having been directed by said office to fire probationary employees, quote, each agency had and still has discretion to hire and fire its own employees, end quote. On a happier note, we learned that the San Francisco Art Institute is soon to take shape. The San Fran Chronicle reported the historic institute closed in 2022 after 152 years of operation and subsequently bought by a nonprofit, will undergo full renovations and feature a visual arts program, quote, rooted in studio practice, end quote, but notably will not be an accredited art school. So it's kind of returning, but not really. And finally, for the day, honeys, we learned, along with the rest of the art world, that more medieval texts were scribed by women than previously believed. According to a new study published in Nature earlier this month, nearly 110,000 handwritten manuscripts produced in Latin Roman Catholic Europe between 400 and 1500 CE were copied by women. In what might be the first such project, researchers analyzed over 20,700 colophons, or short info descriptions about the scribes, commissioners' production details at the times of a medieval manuscript found within it, which were completed between the 800s and 1600s to identify women scribes. They found many inclusions of illustrations of women among colophon information, most often suggesting female authorship. However, the researchers note that some women scribes hid their gender more than others and, quote, in instances where male-only licensed notaries recorded their names toward the end of the manuscript, women scribes may have written their names in the margins instead, end quote. The total amount of analyzed texts only accounts for about 1.1% of the estimated 10 million manuscripts produced during that period, but researchers from the University of Bergen in Norway say say their findings suggest that there were dozens of women scribes yet to be identified. One of the study's authors, Aslaug Amundsen, writes, quote, "The study particularly highlights the significant contribution of female scribes in 15th century literary culture and is a reminder that many of the manuscripts surviving today were products of female communities." End quote. That is all for the week, honeys. I'm going to get outside and enjoy some of this beautiful weather we've been having lately. Take care, hydrate or dihydrate. We will talk very soon. This podcast is produced and created by master's degree holder Celia Bugno, who also researched, host, and fact-checked the episode. Our sound editor and intro-outro music creator is Chris Meinhold. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you choose to listen, as well as on our social media pages.